All right, so let's take a look at the urinary system. So, got a little joke here for you the first time. So, you're in for a great time studying the urinary system. Don't everybody laugh. All right, so let's take a look at the organs of the urinary system first. So, it's pretty simple. There's not a whole lot of organs of the urinary system. There are four basic ones, as you can see here. We have the kidneys. All right, so obviously there are two kidneys, right and left. And the kidneys are actually in the back of the abdominal cavity. So, people always say they're in the back, but remember they're not in the dorsal body cavity because that is the only thing that's back there is the spine and the brain. They're actually in the abdominal body cavity. They're just in the very back of that, the dorsal part of the abdominal body cavity. And they're actually enclosed in a lot of fat and capsules, so sometimes they're hard to find in the back of the abdominal cavity. I don't know if you remember that from your dissection of the fetal pig, but they can be hard to find. So you have two of them, right and left, and the right one is actually sits, you can sort of tell this sits a little lower than the left one, and that is because the liver is up here and the liver pushes down the right one a little bit, so the left one's usually higher. And then you see these yellow things sitting on top here. These are the adrenal glands. They are part of the endocrine system. And you'll see here, we'll talk about the adrenal glands. They do function with the kidneys. They release adrenaline, but they release some other things that are going to help control our water balance, right? Which is what the kidneys are going to help with. The ureters are basically tubes that lead from the kidneys down into the bladder. So the bladder is next. That's this sac here that holds the urine. And the urethra is the little tube at the end that basically releases the urine to the outside. So basically we have those four organs of the urinary system: kidneys, ureter, bladder, urethra. All right, that's basically it. All right, so let's take a look at the kidneys in a little bit closer depth. All right, so this is a sagittal cut through the kidney so that you can see the front and back. Actually, it's not a sagittal cut; it'd be a frontal cut. And so there's parts of the kidney that I want to go over here. All right, so the parts of the kidney here. This is the artery. So this comes from the abdominal aorta, and so blood comes into the kidney through the renal artery. And then I want you to see here that it goes the whole way around. You see that there's arteries the whole way around the outside of the kidney. So what happens is then blood gets filtered. So the function of the kidney is to filter out the blood, take out all the waste products from the blood, return some water to the blood, and then make urine. So we get rid of those waste products. Okay? So then once that happens, you can see then blood comes back out through the renal vein, goes into the vena cava, and goes back up to the heart. Okay? So the general function of the kidney is to filter out the blood, get rid of the waste products, and return what's needed in the blood back to the blood to go to the vein and, go back up to the heart to be reoxygenated. All right, so I want to see that there's a couple parts here. So the first thing I'm going to do here is this thing is called a nephron. So these we're going to talk a lot more about here in a little bit, but these are like the functional unit of the kidneys. And this is only showing you one nephron, but I'm going to draw a couple of them because there's a whole bunch of nephrons all along the kidney here. All right, they're basically everywhere all along the kidney. All right, so I'll just draw a couple of them here. All right, and they have big loops here you'll see here. So they're all along here. So blood comes in, and it basically gets filtered out through the nephron. It's the functional unit, and then urine is made when that's done. So the renal cortex is labeled right here. This is the outside part of the kidney, so it's all along this outside here. This is the renal cortex, and you can see here that this part of the nephron and some tubes in the nephron are in this renal cortex. So I'm just going to put here, this is the filtering part of the kidney. All right, so it's because of the nephrons here, but the cortex is where blood actually gets filtered. And then the medulla, I'll put that right here, that is this part. So this sort of darker red part here of the kidney. And this is where sort of urine is concentrated or made. Okay, and again, it's because of these tubes here of the nephron that does that. But you can see they're down in this renal medulla part. All right, and then the renal pelvis is this part right here, sort of this yellowy part, and that collects the urine. So from all these parts here of the medulla that is making the urine, then it goes down into this renal pelvis, and you can see the arrows here. So it collects all of this, and it's going to go down into the ureter to take to the bladder. All right, so the pelvis is the part that sort of collects all that urine. All right, and so the nephron is the functional part of the kidney. All right. All right, it's what actually does the filtering and the making of the urine. Okay, so it's because of that the kidney can do its job. And we'll learn more about the nephron in a little bit. All right, so that's the major parts of the kidney. If we look inside the kidney, about a quarter of the blood passes through the kidney each minute. So it's pretty good at doing its job. All right, lots of filtering that goes on. All right, so that just shows you the renal artery and the renal vein. All right, so now let's take a look at the ureter. Ureter is pretty simple. It's just a tube that leads from the kidneys down to the bladder. They're about 25 to 30 centimeters long. All right, so pretty small or short, and they push down the urine into the bladder through a process called peristalsis. So we saw peristalsis in the esophagus of the digestive system because it has muscles all along there to push it through. Same thing in the ureter. So it's really not much to the ureter, they're just tubes, all right, that takes the urine down into the bladder. All right, so now let's take a look at the bladder. So the bladder holds about 500 milliliters of urine at a time, but it can stretch to about a liter. So I'll just put here to 1 liter. So it's a muscular bag that can increase in size if you have more urine. So it's usually about 500 milliliters, but it can stretch to about a liter more. All right, so now let's talk about what happens when that bladder gets full. So the bladder is just basically a sac to hold the urine, and the urethra is what allows the urine to pass to the outside when we go to the bathroom. All right, so here's the bladder. Here's the urine inside the bladder, and you see here that we have what are called sphincter muscles. So we actually have two muscles that are involved in the urethra to get us to go to the bathroom. So we have this internal sphincter, so I'll put it about right here. All right, and I'm going to label that. So this is the internal sphincter muscle, and I'll tell you how this works in a second. And this is a involuntary muscle. And then you actually have a second sphincter muscle. I'll put it down here where this big red thing is. That's what this is representing. This is the external sphincter. And this is voluntary. All right, so what happens when you need to go to the bathroom? So urine collects in the bladder. So what happens is when you have about 200 milliliters, remember it can hold up to 500 milliliters. When you have about 200 milliliters, it's starting to get pretty full. So a little bit of urine leaks down through this internal sphincter. Remember, it's involuntary, so you can't control that. It leaks down past the internal sphincter into the urethra. And what that does is it puts pressure on this external sphincter. And when it does, that's what makes you feel like you have to go to the bathroom. All right, so you get this feeling that you have to go to the bathroom. But this external sphincter, remember, is voluntary. So you control when you release that urine then. So you get the pressure on there, feeling like you have to go to the bathroom. And then hopefully that waits until you actually sit on the commode or stand by the commode and you release that external sphincter. All right, that's voluntary. And obviously then go to the bathroom, all right, into the commode. So this urine will leak down in here, puts pressure on here. It makes you feel like you have to go to the bathroom, but then you decide when you release that, okay? And then all that urine will come out. So that's how we control, when we go to the bathroom. So basically, if you ignore that, more urine will come in the bladder, more will leak down here, and then that's why you get that increasing sensation. So we can control and sort of ignore that for a while. But then as more urine gets in there, it puts more pressure on the urethra, on the external sphincter, and that's where you get that urge to have to go again. All right? And then sometimes that gets pretty urgent, basically, and you have to go. So basically, two things can happen here. Incontinence, I'll tell you a little bit about that. That's when the external sphincter doesn't work and you leak urine. So that can happen. Obviously, it happened when we were all babies. We didn't have control of our external sphincter. That's why we had to wear diapers. And eventually you get control of the smooth muscle there of the external sphincter, and that's when you become potty trained. That can also happen as we get older. Sometimes a little leaks through there and you can't control that external sphincter, even though it's supposed to be voluntary. That's why we have adult diapers and things like that. Sometimes maybe like when you sneeze, some comes out. So that can happen. And then the opposite of that is urinary retention, and that's when this external sphincter doesn't release for whatever reason. Sometimes that can be happen when there's some glands down here that are pushing on it and it won't release, so you can't go to the bathroom. That happens a lot after you're under anesthesia. That's why they have to have a special bag basically to release your urine into the bag, because that is not working properly after anesthesia, and eventually that should start working again. But that's sort of the opposite. That's retention, when you can't go to the bathroom. Incontinence is when you're going to the bathroom when you shouldn't be. Okay? All right, so that's basically the parts of the urinary system. Again, kidney, ureters, bladder, urethra. Okay? So those are the parts you need to know and what they do.